Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. Apologies for wearing a jacket, and also apologies, I haven't got a PowerPoint, and it's probably not as well timed as some of the other contributions. We've been a little bit preoccupied with the odd government announcement from day to day, minute to minute, it seems to be at the moment. But it is nice to follow the National Audit Office, a very good public sector body, staffed by public servants, and many of whom are PCS members as well. So that's very good to see the quality of work that's done in the public sector. There's a bit of a debate in the union about whether I should come or not. Are we in favour of outsourcing? Would it be a good thing for us to be associated with the conference or not? Personally, I'm never one to avoid a challenge, and also we've got a slightly schizophrenic attitude as a union, perhaps a bit Jekyll and Hyde. We've got about 30,000 members in the private sector. About 10% of our membership has followed privatisations over the last 30 years into the private sector, and we aim to have a constructive relationship with all the private sector employers where we have members. And I suppose partly it's to say our policy is to follow and to try and organise within the private sector. We come as part of the package with TUPE and other things. We bring our horns and tails with us and try and get organised behind. But we do aim to have a constructive relationship, and some of you, I noticed, some of the people who are here, we recently signed a concordat with 8 or 9 of the major IT deliverers, Accenture, Capgemini, Fujitsu, what was EDS, now Hewlett-Packard, IBM, and so on, all of the ICT providers, to try and make sure there is a good employee-employer relationship, to talk about skills, procurement, and sort of social environmental responsibility. So if you like, there is a real dimension to our involvement with the private sector. It's not just an academic one from within the public sector saying public sector good, private sector bad. But I do want to just sort of challenge or maybe sort of give an alternative view to the sort of premise that seems to be floating around in terms of the conference, that the government's cuts are going to be good for the private sector, and that's going to lead to loads of more outsourcing. And I suspect that some of you read the Guardian today, the front page of the Treasury review, which is talking about the impact of the government cuts being about equidistant, actually, in terms of the number of public sector jobs to go, over 100,000, the number of private sector jobs to go, 120 to 140,000, as a result of the cutback on contracts and public spending from the government expenditure. And I know our members in the private sector are as worried about the impact of the expenditure cuts in terms of their jobs as many of our members in the public sector. And I think one of the reasons why we're saying that is a real risk is that the scale of cuts that is being contemplated, the 25 to 30% in lots of the mainstream government departments, isn't going to be achieved by minor efficiency changes. It's actually going to be a result of cuts in major programmes, and that's just going to result in lower public expenditure, which will mean there'll be less money available for outsourcing or procurement and other things. And I suppose that impact is not just on the procurement process. I was in the run-up to the general election in Barnsley, and Barnsley, 60% of their economy is now in the public sector, be it the health service, education, civil service and elsewhere. And clearly the impact on the public sector, if jobs go, runs straight across into the private sector economy as well, in terms of money for local jobs, in terms of shops, restaurants and so on. So there is often this sort of false division that is painted between the, if you like, what's good for the private sector is bad for the public sector and vice versa. Very often their fortunes run hand in hand. And if the economy is doing well, both do well. If the economy is doing badly, both do badly. And it's not one necessarily at the expense of the other. I know you're not going to believe what I say all the time, so I'm going to sort of litter this with odd quotes from people who might have a little bit more credibility than me in terms of what I say. So this one is, if you like, about is there some limit to the extent of where the private sector should have a role and where the public sector should have a role. And this is a recent quote. Over-reliance on contractors can lead to the erosion of the in-house capacity that is essential for effective government performance. Such over-reliance has been encouraged by one-sided management priorities that have publicly rewarded agencies for becoming experts in identifying functions to outsource and have ignored the costs stemming from the loss of institutional knowledge and capability and from inadequate management of contracted activities. That was President Obama's budget director in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and I suspect reinforced in the aftermath of the BP disaster, that's saying that there are some inherently governmental functions that need to remain within the public sector, and that an untrammeled, if you like, private sector is not something that is possible. And I think that is one of the things that gets in the way of the debate. There are clearly things that the public sector can't do, is not capable of doing, as was just being said, and similarly things that the private sector doesn't do well or shouldn't do, and vice versa. And I mean, my experience, and this is where I'm going to quote a bit from the 30 years, I'm sure our paths must have crossed at some point talking around the Cabinet Office in the early 80s, but in my experience, this debate that you're having today, discussion, is a very similar one that's taken place with every government over the last 30 years. There's always been this discussion. And although it's always pretended that outsourcing is about efficiency, in reality, most of it has been driven by ideological requirements or changes. And we always have this discussion. There should be a level playing field. There should be some rules for the game. Let's do and see. It could go one way or the other. But actually, if you look at it in practice, there's normally been a trend which has been driven by policy rather than by the outcome of the process. And I'll just give you one example quite recently, because I think it's going to be quite pertinent. There was, in the Department of Work and Pensions, an efficiency study into whether the Welfare to Work programme was going to be better run by the third sector and the private sector, or better run in the public sector. Every study they did came up with the answer that actually it was better done in the public sector. The outcome of the tests and the results was that the public sector was better. Clearly, the outcome of the decision was that everything should be handed over to the third sector and the private sector, completely in contrary to the findings which they came up with. And that experience, I suppose, of how things happen is that there's talk around efficiency, and this might be a bit that's uncomfortable for some people in the room, but how does that efficiency normally arise? And this is where I do put my trade union hat on. Our experience is that most of the efficiency gains that come from outsourcing come from reducing the number of jobs, changes and reductions in pay and conditions, or reduction in the quality of service, not in producing the same service in some mythical, magical, more efficient way. And I'll give you another example. One of my first jobs in what was a small union then that looked after about 10,000 cleaners, and was to have a trainload of cleaners come down from Newcastle in their gear with mops and buckets to lobby outside Downing Street about the first privatisations of cleaning that was going to take place, but also for the retention of the Fair Wages Resolution, which was something that meant you couldn't pay less in the private sector than in the public sector. And you might have picked up recently, Boris Johnson's going on about the London living wage and living wages in the procurement and in outsourced areas. In all those 30 years, there has actually been significant underpayment and cutting of pay in those sorts of cleaning jobs and those sort of facilities management companies. And the reason why there has to be a living wage campaign now is because of the practice of over all of that period where living wages have not been paid. And so our real experience we get from our members in the private sector is that there is a real cut in terms of their paid jobs and conditions. So the other argument, though, is cheaper, better in the private sector. And again, some experience. One of the arguments put forward about the private sector is it's such a better risk taker and it can manage profit and expectation and is really good at these sorts of things, which the public sector is not capable of doing. And this is another quote. The private finance initiative no longer requires much private finance or initiative. Now, that's actually from George Monbiot, so you'd really expect him to say that. That's his sort of line. But it was sort of repeated in a way, and this was the House of Commons Select Committee on Transport, which said the private sector will never expose itself to risk unless it is proportionately, if not generously, rewarded. Ultimately, the taxpayer takes the risk or pays the price.